Well, good morning, Pastor Doug.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so
Good.
much for taking the time to join me.
Happy to do it.
I really appreciate it. And I am going to give you an introduction, even though probably the vast majority of our audience is familiar with your work, especially myself. I pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the Reformed world. But if you don't mind, I'd like to just kind of introduce you. This is New Creation Ministries International Kingdom Interview Series. And Doug Wilson is the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He is a prolific writer and has written numerous works on theology and culture, including The Case for Classical Christian Education, as well as A Gospel for All Nations. He's debated the late renowned atheist Christopher Hitchens. He is the co-founder of the journal Credenda Agenda. And in theology, he describes himself as, quote, an evangelical, post-mill Calvinist, Reformed, and Presbyterian, pretty much in that order. I like it. He attended the University of Idaho, where he met his wife, Nancy, whom he married in 1975, and they have 3 children. Well, again, Pastor Doug, it's so good to have you on our show. And I myself just introduced it a few months back with your secretary. What a wonderful lady. She was very responsive. And wanted to discuss eschatology. Now, I myself,
Okay.
I know I wouldn't be called a Calvinist by most Calvinists, but I do subscribe to the doctrines of grace, the absolute sovereignty of Jesus in all things. But of course, I don't subscribe to covenant theology. I subscribe to what's called covenant eschatology. So I want to kind of pick your brain about eschatology, but if you could, in a nutshell, Pastor Doug, kind of give us your eschatological journey to where you are now.
Sure. Happy to do it. So I grew up in evangelical circles in North America, which meant that I sort of grew up in a default pre-mill um, atmosphere. Okay. My father, when he was converted at the Naval Academy, had been given or had gotten a Schofield Reference Bible and had tried to read it for a while, but finally gave up trying to get the notes to match the text, gave it away to somebody, and sort of walked away from systematic theology, particularly systematics on eschatology. So I didn't grow up in any kind of decided dispensational background, but just the atmosphere was generically pre-mill. So, okay, sure, why not? And so I grew up without giving a lot of attention to that. After I uh, after I was grown and out of the home, I remember reading Gordon Ladd's book on I think it was the Blessed Hope or part of it, and came to something of a historic pre-mill position, but not really filled in, and sort of cruised that way for a few years. And the same thing happened to me that happened to my dad. Is I knew the general system, and I was reading my Bible a lot, and I could explain the system, but I couldn't get the system to sort of arise out of the text naturally. I couldn't get the two to match. And C.S. Lewis makes a joke somewhere that for the older divines, if if the text had had smallpox, the sermon wouldn't have caught it. Right. So it was that kind of disjunct. So I was after the Navy, I was a pastor. I found myself pastoring, and in that situation, sort of abandoned any eschatological position at all, because I couldn't make sense of anything. And I went that way for probably 2 or 3 years. I'm guessing, where I was non-mill. I was just nothing. Um, I would tell people, "Look, Jesus is coming back. Don't push me." That's all I know. Jesus is coming back. Um, and during that time, as I was reading, I remember writing in the margin of my Bible, things like post mill question mark, like in the Psalms. Um, what's going on? I started picking up on some of the optimistic prophecies of the earth being as full of the knowledge of the Lord, that sort of thing. But I didn't have any construct. Um, no, I had a bunch of material, but no shelves to put it on. And um, in the mid '80s, uh, I'd started reading the Reconstructionists because in 1980 we had founded Logos School, and we were committed to teaching a Christian worldview thing. I wasn't a Calvinist yet, um, and but I knew the Calvinists were good on things like uh, applying Christian thought to different topics. And so I began reading the Calvinists, and that led me to basically reading some eschatology. And I was reading one book by a guy named David Chilton, Paradise Restored, and I didn't really care for his hermeneutic. He's a little bit too gaudy for me. He's just a little bit too out there for me. So I didn't really appreciate his hermeneutic. His earlier book on productive Christians in an age of guilt manipulators, I had loved. And I think that's what led me to this book. Um, and so I was reading that book, and I'm not sure about all of this, but I read a verse he quoted from 1 Corinthians 15 in the book. And that verse was, "For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." And when I read that verse, something snapped in my head. It was like someone stepping on a dry twig or something. Something snapped in my head. Oh, he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And it was like all these verses and all these things. I said earlier I didn't have any shelves to put things on. Well, it's like the shelves remarkably assembled and attached to the wall, and all the boxes flew up there like in Mary Poppins, and just sort of assembled on the shelf. And it was kind of an exhilarating uh, thing. It was like one of those transformer things assembling in your head, um, or Iron Man putting on his suit. It, it was it was kind of one of the few fun paradigm shifts I've been through.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So interesting that you should bring up David Chilton because I was hoping he would become a part of the conversation. I had the privilege of meeting him back in the early 90s when it just so happened we had a church called Sovereign Grace Bible Assembly in downtown Sacramento. And I had my first attempt at seminary was down there at Talbot Theological Seminary. And there was a young undergrad there, wonderful guy, but he shared with me the doctrines of grace and the sovereignty of God. And I came back home, and of course, my dad was a hardcore follower of John Nelson Darby, William Kelly, all the classic dispensationalists, and that was the school in which I was raised. And so I was disillusioned, and I immediately withdrew, came back to Sacramento, and began reading a lot of the Puritans. Began to fall in love with John Owen, and I eventually got pushed over into all of Tulip. But I started talking with those in the Reformed circles, not the least of which was some of the elders at Jim West's church out in Sacramento.
Yeah.
And they confronted me on the issue of this generation, which, I've come to see obviously as the generation in which Christ lived and to whom he was preaching. But I couldn't buy it because it seemed like they spiritualized so much stuff. And so what ended up happening, though, is I jumped ship. I never, hit amillennialism or postmillennialism. I jumped ship into what some call full preterism or comprehensive preterism, something that is, I readily admit, it's unorthodox in terms of creeds and confessions. But then what ended up happening is I ran into David Chilton. He was living in Diamond Springs at the time. And I had several meetings with him as he was going through a change. And we all know, we're going to let the cat out of the bag for those who don't know. He was severely chastised by those in his circle. not the least of which was Sandelin and Gary North. But he and I had some conversations there in Diamond Springs, and he came to see fulfillment, but as a result, it sort of he was ostracized, and you've been very clear on that with the whole Gary DeMar thing. And
Right.
one of my hopes is that there could be further dialogue. I haven't found. That's why I appreciate you so much, Pastor Doug, that you were willing to do this, because I've tried to get some reformed, because I have great respect for the reformed community, but getting them to have a charitable discussion is really, really hard because we are seen as anathema. Now I've learned to let that kind of, roll off my back a little bit. It was hard though. So, but let's look at David Chilton just a little bit. When you say gaudy, do you mean sort of his, elaborate explanation of metaphor, say, for example, in Days of Vengeance in the book of Revelation? Or are you talking about time issues? What are you referencing when you say gaudy?
No, the gaudiness would be Chilton was an advocate and practitioner of what I would call James Jordan's interpretive maximalism, right? And so when I've read Chilton, read Paradise Restored, read Days of Vengeance, and it was invaluable. For example, Days of Vengeance was invaluable, pointing out connections between Revelation and the book of Ezekiel, lots of good tidbits. But when I'm reading the interpretive maximalists, particularly on a subject as important as eschatology, my pressing question all the time is, where are the brakes on this thing? We're on a switchback grade going down the far side of the Rocky Mountains, and how good are your brakes? Because the concern or the fear that I have is that an interpretive maximalist approach enables you to prove pretty much anything. And so the issue for me is, what does the text require of me, not what does the text allow from me. So if I were to say that the tongues of flame at Pentecost were green, well, the Bible doesn't say that they weren't, right? I'm allowed to say that, but the text doesn't require that of me in any way. And so at the same time, having said that, someone would say, "Oh, you're doing a historical grammatical, you're doing that move." Well, I think that, for example, the John MacArthur world has got their shoes laced too tight on that approach, where it's all sticking close to the shore being measured by a Greek lexicon and your prowess in Greek. I do think that we need to be open to things like typology and literary illusion and things like that. But I believe it has to be rule guided behavior, where I don't just understand what you're saying, but I also have to understand how you got there. How did this how does the text require this of me?
Right, right. Well, that's interesting that you bring up John MacArthur, because, as we both know, he's been involved, well, with the late R.C. Sproul and the Ligonier conferences and so forth. Um, but I want to address this topic because it involves dialogue. One of the things I heard R.C. Sproul say in person at a Ligonier conference, it was either 97 or 99 down in Orlando, is he described dispensationalism. These are his words. He said, dispensationalism is a departure from Orthodox Christianity. So, with that said, he went on to speak on the same platforms as MacArthur. They always joked about their differences on baptism and so forth. But to describe dispensationalism as a departure from Orthodox Christianity, he nevertheless seemed to, by his actions, affirm John MacArthur as a brother, even though, from his perspective, dispensationalism was again, quote, a departure from Orthodox Christianity. And I would say comprehensive preterism is the same. a departure from Orthodox Christianity. I absolutely admit that. So I guess what I'm getting at is, what does it mean in terms of the Reformed world? Like, for instance, would you say that dispensationalism is a departure from Orthodox Christianity? If so, is it a damnable departure? Because that's what's going on with Gary DeMar right now. They're
Right.
wondering, well, where does he stand? Well, he's very obscure. It's very hard. He's very murky, but it appears like he's about to dabble in it. So, could you give all of us your take on what that means, a departure from Orthodox Christianity? And would you also say the same thing, the identical conclusion for preterists?
Okay. Yes, I'd split the difference in various ways. So this, um, I believe, and I'm not trying to make anybody mad, but I think that dispensationalism is weird. Okay, I just think it's. I would probably prefer to call it heterodox. There's some oddball things in there. It's just weird. It's not historical. It's not historical. I think premillennialism, historic premillennialism, goes back at least to the second century. Um, Justin Martyr and people like that, and there were people glancing sideways at those guys back then too. But it's historic premill has got a long history, long heritage in the church. Dispensational Christianity, I think, is an exotic, heterodox variation on historic Christianity. But if I look at the Apostles' Creed and look at the Nicene Creed, a dispensationalist can affirm everything there. Um, so I would say, yeah, dispensationalist, and John MacArthur would be a representative of that stream. And I would say he still has some oddball convictions that I don't share, but I would describe those as historically heterodox. Okay. The reason I think full preterism is a big deal for me, is a bigger deal than that, is because it contradicts the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. It so going back, the Christian Church throughout its entire 2,000-year history has not had agreement on eschatology at all, right? With one exception, and that one exception is that full preterism is wrong. Right. So to confess in the Apostles' Creed, which we say every Sunday in our church, and a couple of one time of the year we say the Nicene Creed. Another part of the year we say the definition of Chalcedon, but most of the time it's the Apostles' Creed. So Jesus Christ will come to judge the quick and the dead, the living and the dead. That is, I think, sort of a baseline ecumenical creedal commitment that the full preterists step away from. Now, that's so in my mind. You then said, is that a damnable heresy? I think it is more than heterodox. I think it's heretical, but damnable heresy is another thing. And I would say and since we're here talking pleasantly, I would say that the issue ought to be a person's qualifications to teach, right? So if let's say someone came to our community, they were a full preterist, they were a sweet Christian, they were sweet Christian, they wanted to join the church. Would I let them? Okay, the answer is yes. I would say, yes, you may join the church, but I don't want you making any trouble. I don't want you starting Bible studies to talk about your eschatological views. I don't want you rocking the boat. I'm willing to fellowship with you, but I don't want you leading Bible studies, and I don't want you, it would go to the person's qualifications to teach. And some of this is you can't work for McDonald's and sell Wendy's burgers. There's that element, but then the larger element is, okay, I think that this is significantly wrong on a very important doctrinal position, and so I don't want to platform teachers to promulgate that. but that's I wouldn't want to disfellowship someone and excommunicate them without a trial, without a full hearing. And until that time, I'm willing to interact with brothers as brothers, but I don't want them to say, please include us within the pale, because I think we lose an awful lot. It's not just a chronological timing thing. I think we lose the big picture, right? What is the nature of sin? What is the nature of fallenness? What is death? I think there's a lot of things bundled up with it.
Sure, sure. Well, if we consider Luther, he obviously went against the grain at the time of the Reformation. Now we both know that there were existing Christians, true believers in God's grace, sola fide and so forth. But Martin Luther had a lot going against him.
Yeah.
And he was an enigma. He was a soul guy,
Right.
going against Rome. And for that matter, I would argue the Orthodox Christian Church at large, especially when we consider how all of them affirmed, at least in the early stages before Rome, transmutation, which ultimately turned into transubstantiation, and then Luther's consubstantiation. That's a big issue that I think not a lot of reformers are dealing with. That is, what did the church fathers believe about the Mass, the Eucharist, the meal?
Yeah.
And but looking at something like this term heretical, okay, and I appreciate your being honest with me and just straight up, because like I said, it's hard to get these discussions because they do think, so many of them, I'm not saying you necessarily, but so many of them would say that we are anathema, accursed from Christ. And I will say that it, coming from the sovereign grace community, that's a hard one because, on the one hand, there's this group, you've heard of Max King, I'm sure, and the Preterist Church of Christ world. So you have their, Pelagianism going on there. And so we both are against that and stand firmly against that. But when we're dealing with someone like me who affirms the absolute deity of Jesus Christ, the absolute sovereignty of God, the efficacy of the atonement, total depravity, unconditional election, all that stuff. Right. I kind of, not that I necessarily am just out for rubbing elbows, but like, for instance, at the symposium back in 1993, James Jordan was there. R.C. Sproul spoke at it. James Jordan said something like this. He said, the reason is kind of related to what you were saying about Nicaea and the Apostles' Creed. The reason I cannot believe in full preterism is because Mama Church told me not to. Now, I see the church as mother, according to Galatians. I think that's pretty clear. But is it possible, though, in this area that really has not had an eschatological consensus or even a council, is it possible that the creeds and confessions may be wrong about the timing of the second appearing or second coming of Christ?
Well, it's possible if it were restricted to timing. Yeah, that's been one of the things that's been up for grabs. That's what the mill, pre-mill, the timing. But I'm talking about the nature of things. Is death an enemy, for example? That's not a timing. That's not a timing issue. Will death ever be conquered? That's not a timing issue. It's the nature of the cosmos issue, and it extends into all kinds of other areas. It deals with eschatology, but also anthropology and protology, and it's a big deal. And I would suggest this. It's not just that, and I simply put this out there for your consideration, right? It's not just that we say that, no, this is a serious first order error. Okay, that's probably the best way I can describe it. Do I believe that there are genuine Christians who have fallen into this first order error? Yes, I do. Okay, so um, are there people who have um, come under the sway of this, or they've been persuaded by the arguments, but they really do know the Lord, and they share a lot of other things with me, like you just said, the tulip thing. Yeah, we agree on that. We agree on that. We agree on that. Um, but this issue is way more than a timing issue, such that I don't just think people in my camp have to say of your camp, that's a first order error. I think you have to say the same thing about us, right? In other words, I think this is a two-way street because um, if the church has been wrong on this, the church has been so wrong about so many things that the only thing you can do is say, well, this little huddled band of Christians in California has finally stumbled on the truth, and they've got true Christianity, and the Protestants, the Catholics, the EO, that whole world out there, they're all screwed up. They really screwed it up. They on the nature of death, the nature of creation, nature of history, everything. So I think that it's not a matter of anathematizing with an ugly spirit. I think that any kind of consistent evaluation of these things would result in mutual anathematizing.
Yeah, and I could see how that might seem to be the logical conclusion. We all are on a journey uh, according to God's providence in learning, and He's very patient with us because we all, of course, are believing something wrong at this very moment.
Right.
We don't necessarily know it, so we're trusting in His long suffering as we learn together. I think just kind of going back to this issue, though, of fellowship, keeping in mind, say this person comes to your church, he's full preterist, he agrees, no, I'm not going to teach it, not going to discuss it. Uh, you would serve him communion, though, I take that, right?
Yes. Yes, I would.
Okay, so you would embrace him as a brother in the Lord.
Right. If he agreed to submit to the government of the church, not agreed to agree with us on this, but if he agreed to submit to our teaching and not be disruptive, then yes, I would do that.
Okay. Well, I know, for example, that Jim West, Gary North, Andrew Sandel, and Keith Matheson, they all very vocally anathematized full preterists. They did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I take it you're a little more gracious than they are.
I'm a liberal. No, I don't want to say gracious, because someone could have that position that they have and be fully gracious. It's a harder line that they draw for various pastoral reasons. Um, and I'm willing to draw a softer line on this if a person is not disruptive and is open. But if someone is dogmatic, saying, no, I'm going to teach the truth of God, and here it is, I'd say, well, if you came into our church, we just have to start excommunicating you. But it'd be a combination of the heterodoxy and the contumacy. So these other guys it sounds like, would excommunicate on the basis of just the doctrine itself. They could say, yeah, this guy is the sweetest guy in the world, but that doctrine is poison, and they would excommunicate. I would say, if he's the sweetest guy in the world and he's not trying to fish in our pond, um, and he's willing to be quiet and be taught so that his family can, learn to worship God together with us, then I would work with someone who's willing to work with us.
Right, right. Obviously, timing, I think we both would agree that revelation shortly come to pass, the time is at hand. Even
Right.
behold, I come quickly. Would you say that those were first century relevant time statements?
Absolutely.
Okay, so when he says, I come quickly and my reward is with me, would you equate that with Matthew 16? The Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father, reward everyone according to his works. There are some here who will not die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Would you equate that
Yeah.
with Revelation 22 and 87?
Yes.
Okay.
So I believe that when Jesus says some here will see, I have to take that as some here will see. um, just call me old fashioned, but yes, I believe that I am a preterist for almost the entire book of Revelation up to the last few chapters, where I believe the descent of the New Jerusalem, I take that in a historicist way. So the descent of the New Jerusalem is something that is occurring down through history. But I think that, and in contrast with the full preterist, I think that when the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven, adorned as a bride for her husband, she's coming down the aisle of the great cathedral. I believe that she eventually gets to the front of the cathedral,
So
and
you,
I think the full preterists have an endless aisle, and the bride endlessly comes down, but she never gets there.
well, for myself, the case is the bride has come down, and the tabernacle of God is with men. He's our God. We are his people, and he dwells among us.
Right.
And so I take 2 Peter 3, Isaiah 65, 66, New Heaven and New Earth, Revelation 21, 22, as all referring to the same thing. Do you interpret 2 Peter 3 the way that John Owen does?
I take it in a preterist way.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But here's the I guess the response to this. There's an old Gahan Wilson cartoon um, that has some guys standing around with tattered robes, kind of ripped, angel wings on the back, and it's sort of an adobe wall behind them, and the word heaven is over the gate with the E fallen over, and there's a couple of beer cans in the corner, and one of them saying, I always imagined it as being a bit classier. Yeah, and so consequently, basically, if you said, Doug, this is it. This is the bride is here. This is the culmination. I'd say, gack.
Well, so you would say then it's basically at least a 2,000-year betrothal, because I mean, John the Baptist was said to be the friend or maybe best man of the bridegroom. So the
Yeah.
bridegroom comes, and
Hmm.
dispensationalists would say, well, he wanted to come, but he had to resort to plan B.
Right.
And that was what the sovereignty of God did for me, is it showed me, oh, there's no plan B with the
Right.
Lord. So did he come to capture Mary and capture his bride? And has that marriage taken place? Or, like I said, are we still kind of in an engagement?
No, when he presents the bride without spot or wrinkle or any such blemish, the bride still has spots and wrinkles and lots of blemishes.
Well, so when Colossians says the church is holy and without blame before him, before his eyes,
Yeah.
um, you're making a distinction then between the imputed
Yeah.
righteousness of Christ versus the church's practice.
Actual state. Right. So I'm making a distinction between justification, which is perfect, and I believe individual Christians are justified and declared perfect in Christ, even though their sanctification might be a bit tattered as of last Wednesday. There's problems. So I believe that the presentation of the bride without spot or wrinkle or any such blemish, I think, is an eschatological statement in real time. There's going to come a grand crescendo, a time when the wedding is consummated, and I don't think that has happened yet. But I also don't think that 2,000 years is that long. It is for us because we are like fruit flies. We measure everything in terms of our own lived experience. But here in Moscow, there are people who are 100 years old, and they were born in 1924. And the day they were born, they could have been put on the lap of someone who was 100 years old, who was born in 1824. That's two lifetimes. And we're back to 1824. If you did that a third time, then it would be 1724 before our country was founded. So 10 such lifetimes take you back to William the Conqueror, and 20 back to the time of Christ. It wasn't that long ago. We think of it as ancient times, but we have a distorted view of time. I was just another little thing to illustrate this. If you go from Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis to the time of Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis, okay, that's 2,300 years. 2,300 years. And if you took that space of time and added it to the end of the book of Genesis, like they were two boxcars, the second ending would be around the time of King Arthur. If you did that a third time, the end of it would be 800 years in our future. And that's just the first book of the Bible. So the first book of the Bible encompasses more time than all the rest of the Old Testament combined. And so consequently, I don't think that we should say 2,000 years, that's a long time. Why isn't this wedding over yet? This is a long wedding. Well, I think our perspective is very bounded.
Mm-hmm. Well, in regard to this time frame, then, when Peter in Second Peter, when he says, "We look for a new heaven and new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness," but you would say that that was fulfilled in
Yes.
870, correct?
I would say if someone said, do you believe that we're living in the new heavens and the new earth now? The answer I would give is yes.
Okay. So for Peter, when he said, "We look for it," he was anticipating it. But
Okay.
the people in the first century before the destruction of the temple, did they have that new heaven and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness? What I'm getting at here is the strange and curious phrase, "already but not yet." And I used to throw that around a lot as a dispensationalist. When I look at the scriptures and the Old Testament scriptures, they prophesied, to me anyway, they prophesied one kingdom, one king, one resurrection,
Mhm.
one hope of Israel. And
Right.
so when I think about the ways that we've sort of partitioned it, well, we have life now. Well, where was that spiritual life prophesied in the Old Testament versus physical life prophesied? So we might defer to Isaiah 26, "Together with my dead body." But when we get to the New Testament, there is this idea that we are now made alive together with Christ and seated in heavenly places with him.
Right.
So was that prophesied? Because Paul told, I believe it was Festus, he says, "I've declared nothing different than that which the prophets did say should come." So
Hmm.
did he introduce a new kind of resurrection? Did Jesus introduce a new one? Or was the same resurrection? Was there just one prophesied?
So when Jesus is talking to Martha before he um, raises Lazarus from the dead, she says, like a pious Jew of her day, that I know he will be raised at the last day. Right. So what Jesus did is and this was the remarkable move that nobody was anticipating, is I believe that God reached into the eschaton and caused the resurrection of the dead to erupt in the middle of human history in the resurrection of Jesus. So not as opposed to the general resurrection of the dead at the end, but as a harbinger or down payment of that coming resurrection. Okay. Now, to touch on the already not yet, I believe that there was an already not yetness in the 40 years between Christ's ascension and the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay. There was one kind of already not yet. I think we're in a different kind of already not yet. Right.
Say it's spiritual.
Well, we're the thing that's not yet is a different thing. So, so when Peter is in that period, it's like the 40 years in the wilderness. Okay, and the transition between the old Judaic aeon and the new Christian aeon is like two runners in a relay race exchanging the baton. The baton exchange is in that 40 years. So the Judaic age is coming to a close. As it says in Hebrews, it's vanishing away, getting ready to vanish away. And that happens, that hits the wall in 70 AD. But the Christian aeon is inaugurated at Pentecost 40 years before. So the Christian aeon starts 40 years before the Judaic aeon ends.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So when Paul is in Jerusalem and he makes an offering for the men who'd taken the Nazirite vow, that entailed a blood sacrifice. In order to do that, God was putting up with the temple apparatus and the temple sacrifices, which were vanishing away, but were not done yet.
Right.
Okay. So that was the already not yet there. So the new heavens and the new earth had been inaugurated, I believe, at Pentecost, but was still occupying the stage together with the old heavens and the old earth, the Judaic aeon. So that was there already not yet. Okay. Now that we're into the new heavens and the new earth proper, we have a different already not yet. Okay. What's already? The new heavens and the new earth is already. What's not yet? Well, the general resurrection of the dead, the graves opening, the bodies coming out, the world being transformed. So probably the central text that I would go to in this whole discussion would be Romans 8. The world is pregnant. The world is groaning as in the pains of childbirth. And it's a different metaphor from the bride coming down the aisle, but it's sort of counting the days. There's going to come a day when the sons of God are revealed for who they are. And when that happens, the whole created order is going to be transformed. No more disease, no more death, no more suffering. Everything is going to be wrapped up. That's the not yet. Okay, so
are you saying then that there is a old heaven and old earth covenant, right? Old covenant, new heaven, new earth, new covenant, and then yet still a physical new heaven and new earth, or new?
Yeah.
Correct. So it's would you call it double fulfillment?
I haven't up to this point in my life, but I probably could be talked into it.
Okay.
Right.
So a dual fulfillment then. So the same, then would you say the same thing of spiritual life in us versus
Yes.
physical life, dual fulfillment of that?
Correct. I've been quickened, born again. Regeneration is the new man being quickened internally. And Paul says, I'm being renewed inwardly day after day. The outer man is decaying because of sin. And that's another already not yet. I've been born again already. Not yet. I've not been raised incorruptible with a body that cannot be touched. That's not yet happened.
Okay, that brings me up to a good point, and you addressed it a little bit earlier, this idea of sanctification. One verse that I used to interpret as an apologetic for progressive sanctification was 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, which says, "But we all with open face are beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, and we are being," present tense, "being transformed into that same image from glory to glory." Now, I would assume that you take that to be true, that applying to us post AD 70.
Yes. So I would apply that to as I come to worship the Lord on the Lord's day, and I'm worshiping God in the face of Jesus Christ. I'm being transformed from one degree of glory to another.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So that's happening. But I also know that when he comes and we see him, we're going to become like him because we're going to see him as he is. That process doesn't start at the second coming. That process is culminated at the second coming. All faithful Christians are in the process now of being transformed into the likeness of Jesus Christ. The last part of us that is affected by that is our bodies. But we are being renewed inwardly as we worship God. Yes, our inner man is being quickened and renewed, and my body, external body, is falling apart because of sin, Paul says. But that too will be raised. That's going to be God's final finishing touch. Okay, you can have your body.
Okay. Well, in that context, though, one of the things you brought up earlier was the historical, contextual, grammatical hermeneutic. And if you
Yeah,
look at that context, it's it seems to me to be thoroughly covenantal, where he's comparing the glory of the old covenant with the diminishing glory, the passing glory, because all those verbs there in 2 Corinthians 3 from 6 through 18, they're all present tense. And he's describing it. And then he gets to the end and says, he's changing us from glory to glory. Well, the context was new covenant and old covenant glory, rather than how I used to interpret it, one degree of glory to another, glory, 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 and so on. But in that context, it seems clearly to be speaking of new covenant glory. That is, that when it says we are being transformed from old covenant glory to new covenant glory, that's that overlap that you were
yeah,
talking.
I don't have any problem with that.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean I do believe that there's a uh, in the Gospel of John, um, basically it's where it says grace upon grace, right? Uh, Charis anti charis. It's like uh, grace instead of grace. Moses brings grace. Christ brings more grace. Moses brought glory. Christ brings more glory. Yeah, all of it. That's true. But when Christ brings more glory, um, it doesn't stop. Okay, so after the new covenant has already been established and operational, and um, Paul is functioning in terms of it, he says in Romans that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. So even though the transition from old covenant glory to new covenant glory has already been established in Paul, he's anticipating a time when there's going to be more glory yet.
Okay. So there is this gloriousness that is happening. Um, you had mentioned, you quoted, I believe it was Hebrews 8, when you described the overlap. And in Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 10 quotes it as well, where it says that their sins and their iniquities I will remember no more. And then he says, in that, he says, and they shall all be taught of God. Now, when I was talking with David Chilton, he said, I always used to believe that there would come a day when if you'd throw a rock, you'd hit a Christian. And
Mm-hmm.
he said that based upon the earth shall be covered with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's
Right.
a very, that's a verse that optimistic postmillennialists really champion. And I understand
Right.
why. But Hebrews says that when the culmination of that transition period came to pass, he seems to be saying, and at that moment, they shall all be taught of God. And Jesus associates they all being taught of God with resurrection in John 6.
Okay.
Um, so are we all taught of God in the new covenant since that has taken place?
No,
No. Okay.
no,
Okay.
because if we were all taught of God, we'd be behaving better than we are.
Okay. So when we speak about being taught of God in Hebrews 8, when he associates it with the culmination of the old covenant and the full establishment of the new.
Well, no, stop you there. The full establishment of the new that's where we're hanging up. You can have you can have the establishment of the new, which I believe fully was established and set on track in 70 AD, when the Judaic Aeon came crashing to a halt under judgment. Then we were now in the Christian Aeon, and nothing but the Christian Aeon. Okay, so the Christian Aeon is established. Is the Christian Aeon fully established? No.
So would you say that to a certain degree, the dispensationalists are right in that the church is sort of an interim period?
No, the church is in an immature period. So the church was in the second century, the church was in its infancy. That was the toddler church.
Would you say, based upon your description of time earlier, 2,000 years is a small time, that we're still in our infancy?
No, I would say that we're in our awkward junior high years right now. Lots of lots of acne, lots of bumping into things. And quite honestly, seriously, I think that Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox like to look back at the primitive church as though it just stepped down from heaven and it was all perfect and complete. I think it was more like a baby or a toddler that hadn't learned how to use utensils yet. There were all kinds of crazy things that the early Christians did, but it was a healthy baby, and you expect growth and maturation to happen over time. So when someone says, "Oh, the early church, they did this or they did that and they did the other thing," and I'd say, "Yeah, I did a lot of things when I was 2." Right? Well, I'm concerned that there not have been any birth defects. And I think there was a lot of maturation that happened in the Reformation, but I think there's a long, long, long way to go.
Right. But potentially, if, as I've discussed with many postmillennialists, but potentially this could go on for another 30,000 years, right?
Yes, correct. Yes. So this is something I say often. I believe that we are still part of the early church.
Okay, so really still in its embryonic or infancy state.
Yeah, I'd say probably a little older than that, but I believe that 10,000 years from now, future school children will be studying hard for their history test. Who lived first? Was it Athanasius or C.S. Lewis? I can never keep those guys straight, because we have trouble between distinguishing a 4th century church father and a 2nd century church father. For most Christians, it's all one to us. Well, I think that's going to be the case for future students. They're going to have trouble. I think we're still part of the early church. I think we're still figuring things out.
Yeah. Well, Pastor Doug, I want to respect your time. I know you're tremendously busy, but you have no idea how grateful I am that you took time out of your schedule to have this discussion. I love your charity. I love it that you were willing to do this. I'd love to do it again sometime. I think the subject of the nature of Christ is preeminent in all of this, and because his nature affects our nature, obviously, and physical body, resurrection life, all that stuff. But I am just so grateful to you, and hopefully in the future we can have another warm, charitable discussion like this, brother.
Well, I appreciate you talking with me, and I appreciate you talking with me this way. If you don't mind my putting it, I think your interaction has been gracious and pleasant and profitable, and that's not always the case with full preterists.
Right.
Winston. I think of Winston Churchill's definition of the fanatic as someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. And so you are seeking to integrate what you're thinking here across a spectrum of other ideas, and I would just leave you with this thought: however hard the Orthodox position is on your position, I do think that given the ramifications, that would have to be reciprocated. I think just logically it has to go both ways. Anyway, I appreciate your spirit.
Absolutely. Well, God bless you richly, Pastor Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you.